I never should have gone up there alone. It was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas, just me and the snow. That was the plan, get away from the city, unwind, maybe read a book by the fire while snow piled up outside. I thought I was being smart, thought I needed a break from people. I was wrong. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, one of those places that had been in the family for generations. When I told him I needed somewhere quiet for the holidays, he handed me the keys without hesitation. Stillwater Lake, he said. It's perfect this time of year. No one around for miles. That part wasn't a lie. I drove up on December 23rd. The snow had started to fall about halfway there, just a light dusting that settled on the road. The further I got from town, the darker the sky seemed to grow. The trees thickened, crowding the narrow path leading up to the lake. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was almost gone. It was smaller than I expected, one story with a sloped roof and a chimney that hadn't seen smoke in years. The wood was weathered, almost grey, and the front steps creaked when I walked on them. The lock stuck at first. I had to force the door open with my shoulder. Inside, it smelled like old pine and something faintly metallic. I told myself it was just dust. The cabin had power, but barely. A single light hung from the center of the room, casting long shadows against the wood-paneled walls. There was a small kitchen, a stone fireplace, and a narrow hallway that led to the bedroom and bathroom. It felt cold, despite the heater humming in the corner. Still, I unpacked, threw some logs into the fireplace, and settled in. That first night was quiet. I sat by the fire with a book and a glass of cheap whiskey. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the lake until it disappeared beneath a sheet of white. The silence was almost too much. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something standing just beyond the glass. But there was nothing, just trees and snow. I slept on the couch that night, too uneasy to venture down the hall. The next morning, I found footprints. I'd gone outside to grab more firewood, and there they were, leading from the edge of the forest straight to the porch. One set, barefoot. I stared at them for a long time, half convinced I was imagining things. The prints were small, like they belonged to a child. But they were deep, pressed into the snow, and they stopped right at the front door. No return trail. I looked around, but the forest was empty, just silence and trees. I should have left then. Instead, I went inside and locked the door. By the afternoon, the snow had started coming down harder. I couldn't see the lake anymore, just white pressing up against the glass. I kept glancing at the footprints. Even when they were out of sight, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I tried calling my friend, no signal. The nearest town was miles away, and with the storm rolling in, driving back wasn't an option. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal. Maybe the snow had shifted. That night, I locked every window and barricaded the front door with a chair. I slept with the fire burning low, listening to the wind howl through the trees. I woke up to knocking. It was soft, rhythmic, like someone gently tapping on the window pane. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. Tap, tap, tap. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the dark window across the room. The knocking stopped. I didn't move until the fire had nearly gone out. By morning, I found more footprints. This time, they circled the cabin. I don't remember much of that day. I barely ate. I sat by the window, watching the snow pile higher and higher. I could feel something out there. By evening, I was running on pure nerves. I barricaded the door again and piled furniture in front of it, everything I could find. I slept with the fire roaring, sweat pooling down my back, despite the cold air pressing against the glass. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. The fire was out. I sat up, listening. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing in from all sides. I waited, straining to hear past the thudding in my ears. Then, tap, right against the glass. I turned slowly. There, just outside the window, was a face, pale, wide-eyed, staring at me from the other side of the glass. I couldn't breathe. I scrambled off the couch, knocking over the chair and sending it clattering to the floor. When I looked back, the window was empty, but the footprints were there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the storm had eased enough for me to dig out the car. I didn't even pack. I just grabbed my keys and left everything behind. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. There was someone standing at the edge of the forest, small, barefoot, watching me leave. I never told my friend what happened. I don't think he would believe me anyway, but every winter I think about those footprints, and I wonder if they're still there, circling the cabin in the snow. I never used to mind long drives. Something about the hum of the engine and the steady stretch of highway felt calming, even peaceful. But that was before last December. I'd taken a new job out of state, one that paid well, but came with the unfortunate side effect of forcing me to make long trips during the holidays. I didn't mind. I wasn't much for celebrating Christmas anyway. The drive between Idaho and Colorado was lonely, sure, but I liked the quiet. This time, though, the weather didn't agree with me. The storm started somewhere past Twin Falls. The forecast had warned of snow, but nothing like this. By the time I hit the 2-lane roads through the mountain passes, visibility was down to maybe 10 feet. I could handle snow. I had chains and enough gas to last the night if I needed to pull over. But it wasn't the snow that got to me. It was the man on the side of the road. I almost didn't see him. He was standing just beyond a curve, a dark shape barely visible in the headlights. I hit the brakes and eased to a stop, the tires crunching over thick ice. He didn't move, just stood there, wrapped in a heavy parka, his face hidden beneath a scarf and hood. I didn't want to stop. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to let someone else handle it. But the storm was brutal, and I couldn't just leave him out there. I rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" He nodded, silent. Something about him felt off. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, brushing snow from his coat. He didn't thank me, didn't even look at me. "Where you headed?" I asked, forcing a polite turn. He just pointed forward. I figured he wasn't much for talking, and that suited me fine. The drive stretched on in silence. The snow thickened, swirling in the high beams like static on an old TV. I could barely see the edge of the road. Every so often, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye. He sat stiffly, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead. His coat was too thin for weather like this. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. He wasn't shivering. It was freezing in that car. My heater barely worked, and my breath fogged the windshield. I had gloves and a hat, but he didn't even seem to feel it. I tried to brush it off. At one point, I slowed down as I approached a sharp turn. The road dipped steeply, and the ice beneath the tires groaned. His hand shot out, gripping the dashboard. That was the first time he reacted to anything. "Steep," he muttered, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah," I replied, glancing at him. "Pretty dangerous stretch." He didn't say anything else. We drove for another hour. I started to feel uneasy, not scared exactly. But the longer he sat there, silent and rigid, the more I felt like I'd made a mistake. I told myself I was overreacting. But every time I looked at him, I noticed small things. His hands, they didn't seem cold. No redness, no trembling. His coat, it looked dry, even though he'd been standing in heavy snowfall. And his face, what little I could see of it, was pale. Too pale. Eventually, I tried to make small talk. "Been out here long?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he murmured, "Long enough." I forced a chuckle. "Not a fan of hitchhiking in storms, huh?" This time, he turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see part of his mouth beneath the scarf. "It's not so bad," he said. Then he smiled, Something about that smile sent a shiver through me. It wasn't warm. It wasn't grateful. It felt wrong. Like he knew something I didn't. I pressed harder on the gas. After a while, I noticed the fuel gauge. I'd filled up before leaving, but somehow the needle had dipped closer to empty than I expected. I told myself it was just the cold messing with the engine. Need to stop for gas soon, I muttered. He didn't respond. When I finally spotted a gas station, I pulled in without hesitation. The place was old, one of those run-down stations with a single pump and flickering overhead lights. The building itself looked abandoned, but the pump seemed to be working. I parked and stepped out, grateful for the break in silence. The air was biting. As I started pumping, I glanced toward the passenger seat. He hadn't moved. I went inside to pay, but the station was empty. No attendant, no sound except the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. When I came back out, he was gone. The door to the car was shut, but the passenger seat was empty. For a moment, I stood there, staring at the open road stretching ahead. There were no footprints in the snow, none leading away from the car. I got back in and drove. I didn't stop again until I reached my brother's house. When I pulled into the driveway, I realized something else. The seatbelt on the passenger side was still buckled. I didn't sleep that night. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still sitting next to me whenever I drove. I tried to forget about it, but sometimes, when the snow falls heavy and the road stretches on longer than it should, I still catch glimpses of something in the corner of my eye, a shape just barely visible in the glass. A man sitting perfectly still, smiling. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to stay in a roadside motel over Christmas, but life, as I've learned, rarely goes as planned. It started with a simple plan: drive up north to visit my sister for the holidays. She lived in a small town, about 8 hours from where I was. I packed my bags, filled the tank, and left early in the morning to avoid the holiday traffic. Somewhere along the way, snow started falling. Light at first, but by the time I hit the halfway mark, it had turned into a full-blown blizzard. The highway stretched empty in both directions. No cars, no signs of life, just me, the wind, and the endless white pressing against the windshield. I thought I could push through, but after another hour, visibility dropped to almost nothing. I missed the exit twice because I couldn't see the signs until I was past them. Eventually, I found a narrow turnoff and followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere safe to wait out the storm. That's how I found the motel. It was the kind of place you drive past without noticing. A faded neon sign flickered near the entrance Pinewood Lodge, though there wasn't a single pine tree in sight. The parking lot was empty, except for one other car, half buried in snow. I pulled up to the front office. Inside, an old man sat behind the desk, watching a small TV. A Christmas tree sat in the corner, decorated with cheap tinsel and blinking lights that seemed out of place in the dim yellow lighting. "You still open?" I asked, shaking snow off my coat. He looked up slowly, as if I'd interrupted something important. "Storm's got you, huh?" I nodded. "Room 12. "Last one down the hall," he said, sliding a key across the counter. "No credit card." "Cash only," he replied, eyes drifting back to the TV. I didn't argue. I handed him a few bills, took the key, and stepped back out into the cold. Room 12 was exactly what I expected: plain, cold, and old. A floral patterned bedspread lay on the bed, stiff as cardboard. The heater rattled when I turned it on, but at least it worked. The bathroom smelled faintly of mildew, and the single window faced the empty parking lot. I didn't care. I was tired, cold, and just grateful to have shelter. After locking the door, I unpacked a few things and collapsed onto the bed. The wind howled outside, shaking the thin walls, but I was warm and safe inside, or so I thought. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but As I sat up and listened, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. They echoed faintly through the thin walls, moving down the hall. I told myself it was probably the old man from the front desk, or maybe the driver of the half-buried car. But then they stopped, right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock. None came, just silence. I crept to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to peek outside. The lot was empty. No lights, no movement. After a minute, the footsteps started again, continuing down the hall toward the far end of the motel. I told myself I was imagining things. Alone in an unfamiliar place, your mind plays tricks on you. I locked the door and double-checked the chain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just inches away from me, separated by a flimsy piece of wood. The next morning, the storm had eased slightly, but the roads were still covered in snow. I decided to stay one more night. Driving in those conditions wasn't worth the risk. I spent most of the day reading and flipping through the limited TV channels. Around noon, I saw the old man in the parking lot shoveling snow. I waved, but he didn't wave back. By evening, the wind picked up again. I ordered takeout from a nearby diner and ate in bed, watching reruns of holiday specials. That's when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they started at the far end of the hall. I muted the TV, heart racing. They grew louder, closer, stopping at each door along the way. When they reached mine, I waited, breath held. The doorknob rattled. I jumped up, pressing my back against the far wall. The chain rattled slightly, but the lock held. After a moment, the footsteps moved on. I stayed awake for hours, listening. They never came back. The next morning, I went to the front desk to check out. "How many other guests are here?" I asked casually, trying to mask the unease in my voice. The old man frowned. "Just you. What about the other car in the lot?" He squinted out the window. "That's been there for months. Belonged to a fella who left and never came back for it." I didn't know what to say. I paid my bill and left as soon as the roads cleared. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The footsteps, the rattling doorknob. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up Pinewood Lodge online. It had been closed for over 2 years.